The President of the United States, Joe Biden, says Americans will continue to pay more for gas for as long as it takes to win the conflict in Ukraine. White House economic advisor Brian Deese suggested the pain at the pumps was a price Americans had to pay for the future of the liberal world order. For more on this, we're joined by Wits University International Relations Professor John Stremlau. Thank you, Prof, for availing yourself this morning. Let's start with this concept of the liberal world order. What are we talking about?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a term of art which is more theoretical than real, but it's useful, and we should take it apart a bit. It's in two parts. It's liberal and then world order. World order is the easy one, and that's the one that Putin is challenging by invading Ukraine. World order is 193 sovereign states that are theoretically equal, but we know they're not, but they're theoretically equal. And that is the evolution of the global order right now, territorial integrity and sovereign equality as the ideal that we're all aspiring to, and it is at the heart of the United Nations. Liberal, it deals more with the political, democratic and capitalistic internal systems and choices that governments make. And increasingly, we are more and more concerned about the events within states as we are in relations among states. And that's certainly the case of Africa and the African Union. But to put these two together, yes, the invasion of Ukraine does challenge the territorial integrity and sovereign equality principle that Martin Kimani, the Kenyan ambassador to the UN, eloquently bore testimony to when saying that African states inherited colonial artifacts that were designed not by Africans but by colonials, and yet they had to start somewhere. So they wanted to build a more peaceful and productive Africa by integrating sovereign states gradually, but let's consolidate those authorities within these states first. And then when extreme human rights abuses occur or other things, that's a matter of collective concern, not just the state's prerogative. So there are limits.
Right. Prof, you speak of nations theoretically being equal. With everything that you have just outlined, who determines equality? Because in some instances, like you pointed out, what's good for the goose is clearly not good for the gander.
Well, you're raising a very interesting question. It's analogous to the principle of inherent equality that this Constitution in South Africa is founded upon. That's an unprovable proposition. We take it as an article of faith, a moral imperative that we are all equal in the eyes of God in the religious sense. So the UN is a compromise, but it's a major step forward in global order because there was just chaos before that, and Europe is the most egregious for its history of tribal wars culminating with World War I and World War II, after all. And what the UN was trying to do is to prevent World War III, but they couldn't do that with just the General Assembly having everyone equal, Nigeria and Benin or South Africa and Lesotho, they're not equal, or the U.S. and Grenada or something. So they had a Security Council, but that's really imperfect. It reflects the victors of World War II. We all know that. But you're not going to solve these problems easily because you've got to get consensus among governments. Meanwhile, what's the essential that we want to protect? Well, sovereign equality and territorial integrity is one, just as we want to protect basic human rights as an ideal, but one that, if it's abused extremely, leads to regional conflict and wars. So in preventing deadly conflict and in promoting prosperity that governments say they believe in. And I must say that at the February meeting of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin in Beijing, they issued a 5,000-word declaration which said they are committed to democracies and they're committed to open economies and universal principles. So there's a lot of hypocrisy around.
Prof, you mentioned that Russia is threatening the world order, maybe potentially creating a new world order. I say this carefully for lack of a better phrasing of this question, but is that such a bad thing? Maybe I go back to the representation of African nations in the United Nations Security Council, for instance, when you take a look at how some African nations and how China has voted when it comes to the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the fact that we still do not have a permanent seat.
Yes, you're correct on that, but you're also is what Russia's done so bad. And I do think it's important for us to all think hard about the practical consequences of excluding China that shows an openness to globalization and cooperation and is an ethnic national state, predominantly Han, that is very different from the pluralism of say, Africa or the United States or the European community that's struggling to try to integrate complex identities. That the Chinese is a civilization state of great importance, and I think you can work with it. Russia is a troublemaker, and Putin is a petrol state. It's got an economy the size of Spain or Texas, and he's showing and galvanizing the Europeans, at least, into a fear of another European war that could escalate. And he broke the rules. After all, he had a treaty with Ukraine that he would never, and that Russia would never aggress against Ukraine if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, which Ukraine did after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So consequently, I think you really have to be careful here of differentiating between the role of Russia in Africa and the role of China in Africa. And I think that the latter can be very constructive and very helpful for the long-term prosperity of Africa.
When we take a look at the topic of the day, these utterances, right, that Americans had to pay for the future of the liberal world order, that's the price they have to pay at the pumps. What do you make of that suggestion?
It's very hard in the immediate to know, because the U.S. has been itself consumed with a constitutional crisis, a state capture problem, if you will, by an empowered minoritarian rule of Republicans, and Biden's hold on office is not at all secure, but he is pointing to the fact that Americans need to face up to the fact that they have to make sacrifices, and no president likes to tell voters that that's what it's in store for them, because he wants to get reelected. So consequently, you're really dealing with an America that for many years has abrogated its any kind of responsibilities on solving practical problems like climate change and getting off of oil. And the epitome of this was Donald Trump on the eve of the pandemic, which was spreading around the world. He pulls out of WHO. He cancels Obama's commitment to the Global Climate Fund that was going to help developing countries mitigate climate change. The U.S. is a very difficult character to deal with internationally, as I'm sure the South African government knows better than I do.
Right. Prof, I do beg your pardon on this, but I do wonder, right? So you've got people that have lived through previous wars, and here we are, well, they living through this one in particular. And when we speak of a new world order, protecting the liberal world order, is it completely impossible that we could find ourselves years down the line in this situation again?
Of another world war. Yes, that's always a risk, especially when powers have nuclear weapons. But I do think that one of the unintended consequences of Putin's rash and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, and more importantly and most importantly, the courage of Ukrainians in fighting for their national self-determination and willing to sacrifice hugely for that Europe has now been galvanized into the practical questions, and the question is, are they going to stay the course and help Ukraine to at least stabilize the situation? There's always the risk, but the U.S. And the Europeans were very cautious. They did not react enough, in my view, to the invasion of Crimea and the Donbass regions of eastern Ukraine in 2014. The Ukrainians had to prove themselves, and they did, courageously. And I think their suffering deserves to focus our minds and find practical ways to make sure that Russia does not repeat this aggressive action or its troublemaking in Africa, for example, which is a whole other subject. It is a problem that needs practical solutions, and it needs international cooperation and understanding. So you're very right. I'm very glad that you're taking time to at least try to get my views on this, and I hope you'll get others.
Absolutely. Prof, before I let you go, I have to ask you this. Is Africa a victim, right, perpetually? And by that I mean you speak of, international relations and our relationship with world powers. You have many sectors on the African continent, and especially young people. This is the youngest continent in terms of the number of young people that are on this continent. Yet when they take a look at not just today, but yesterday being history, it paints somewhat of a bleak picture, even though there's so much work that has been done. But are we the victims? Are we not at a point where we are able to, if you will, create our own world order?
This is a big question, and I'll try to deal with it in a brief way. The Institute for Security Studies, in partnership with the New Partnership for Africa's Development of the AU, has done some scenario writing for Africa, looking out to the 2023 goals of the African agenda. And it's very depressing in light of the horrendous problems that you've alluded to that confront the continent. On the other hand, Africans do themselves no service by thinking of themselves as victims always. They have agency, and they must exercise that agency, as South Africa was inclined to do in the aftermath of the end of apartheid for the first 10 years. And it played a crucial leadership role in Africa in getting the African Union to be the OAU to be reconstituted into the African Union, and all of the related institutions that support it. But there is no leadership right now in Africa, in my view, that is comparable to what was in the aftermath of apartheid when South Africa took that leadership along with Nigeria and others. And the African agency does need to be addressed with regard to China, with regard to the United States, and above all, to solving problems that Africans know they're facing. It's hard, it's very hard, and it needs help. But I think if Africa can set the agenda for the world in terms of how it relates to Africa, that would be a help. And there is efforts along that line going on, and in academic institutions across the continent as well.
Prof, always good to get your insights. Thank you very much for availing yourself this morning, Professor John Stremlau from Wits University.